Good afternoon, East Coast time. Thanks everyone for joining us today, being a little patient as we worked out the final technology here. I'm really looking forward to a great conversation today with businessman, nonprofit leader, and recent presidential candidate, Andrew Yang. This is the latest in our webinar series, The Future of American Elections, where journalist and author Dave Daly, who's a senior fellow at FairVote since 2017, interviews leaders on democracy and elections in America. I'm president of FairVote. We've been a national leader since '92 on how and why to win big structural changes in our electoral system that prevent voters from fair access, fair elections, and fair representation. Core to our vision has been the rules of how we elect people and the barriers to fairness presented by limiting voters to a single choice ballot rather than a ranked choice ballot, and by having winner-take-all voting rules instead of a proportional voting system. Ranked choice voting is on the ballot in a record number of places this fall in 2 states and 5 cities, and Andrew Yang's been super helpful on those. In this past year, we played a big role in catalyzing and supporting 5 state Democratic parties that used ranked choice voting in their presidential primaries and caucuses, which is a common sense change that if we think is applied across all states, would have resulted this year in some 3 million more votes counting for active candidates instead of candidates who had actually already dropped out by the time of the primary. Ranked choice voting was also used to elect major offices at 3 Republican state conventions this year and will be used in November in Maine's presidential and US Senate race. Looking forward, we're excited to partner with allies in Congress and across the states as we make it a national norm. And we also build support for HR 4000, the Fair Representation Act, which is a transformative change that New York Times columnist David Brooks has described as the one reform to save America. We'd love to find ways to connect with anyone who's on this call and wants to get involved into this exciting movement for change. Let me step back and enjoy this conversation like the rest of you. Our senior fellow Dave Daly knows the electoral reform world as well as anyone in America, as reflected in his latest book, Unrigged: How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. So Dave, let me send it over to you.
Thanks, Rob. Welcome, Andrew. Thanks everyone for being here. This is a really exciting moment for structural reform and for ranked choice voting. As Rob mentioned, in the weeks leading to the 2020 election, FairVote has been conducting a series of virtual panels on the future of American elections. There is not a more timely topic, and we've been talking with some of the most visionary thinkers in the electoral reform space about how we create the kind of democracy that lives up to our highest ideals and helps nurture and create the kind of politics and leadership we need in this especially challenging moment. This is our 4th conversation. You can find the previous 3, which have included Massachusetts former Governor Bill Weld, Harvard professor Danielle Allen, as well as authors Joshua Douglas, Catherine Gill, Daniel Newman, and other very sharp minds over on our YouTube channel. I also hope you'll join us here on October 27th for a new webinar called The Conservative Argument for RCV. You can sign up at fairvote.org and clicking on the Future of American Elections webinar series. We want all of you to be involved today, so I'll pose the first several questions, but then we'll open it up to every attendee. If you have questions you'd like to ask, please use the Q&A and the chat functions below. You can go ahead and use those now. You can leave your questions at any time. Our FairVote team will be monitoring those fields, and they'll notice your questions, send them along to me. We are truly honored and thrilled to be joined by one of the most inspiring figures in American politics today, in Andrew Yang, whose 2020 presidential campaign fired the imagination of millions. Yes, Yang's campaign resonated with so many people because he was talking about bold visionary solutions, not only to the problems in the headlines, because he was looking ahead and suggesting how we reorganize society for the challenges we all know are about to come. Systemic thinking about this moment, but also about the future. It is all too rare in our politics, but when we hear it clearly from a citizen, from an entrepreneur, on the debate stage, in a jacket but no tie, we listen. And that systemic approach is one that binds FairVote and the Yang Gang. Let me introduce him more formally. Andrew Yang is an entrepreneur, an author, a philanthropist, and a former 2020 presidential candidate. Initially dubbed a longer than long shot candidate by the New York Times, but he became a top tier contender for the presidency, raising nearly $40 million in grassroots funding, with a vision to rewrite the rules of the United States economy through a freedom dividend of $1,000 a month for every American adult. Andrew became one of the most exciting stories in the 2020 race. His His nationwide support propelled him to 7 Democratic primary debates, outlasting 6 governors, 6 senators, 4 governors, 3 members of Congress, 2 mayors, and 1 former cabinet secretary. Pretty good. A surprising, enduring political force, according to the Washington Post. Andrew has been called prophetical. That is a complicated word to say by Politico, especially those two right back to back, and a phenomenon by the Associated Press, changing the national conversation to a point where now nearly 75% of Americans support a universal basic income. Andrew then founded Humanity Forward, an organization built to realize the vision and ideas of his presidential campaign. Through both advocacy and action, Humanity Forward's vision is to foster a human-centered America that measures each person for their intrinsic value, not their economic value. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you to both of you and Rob for the work you've done on ranked choice voting. Before it was sexy and cool, as now it is becoming sexy and cool. Thanks to you and the people who are here today, and folks who've been working on the ground for years in environments like Massachusetts, Alaska, Maine, and everywhere else to make it happen. So this is one of those situations where I'm going to show up and say, that's a great idea. There have been people fighting for that great idea for quite some time.
Well, thank you. Before we talk about solutions and reforms, I was hoping you might lay out the structural challenges before us. Restoring our democracy, rebuilding trust in our government and our electoral systems. These were at the heart of your presidential platform. Why is that trust so low? Why have our communal bonds crumbled? How do you think we got here?
That I could talk for an hour just on that for sure. I mean, one of the greatest hits as to why Americans are disenchanted with our government, our politics. So right now, I'd say reason number one is that money has completely overrun our politics, and Americans sense it. So if you are an individual homemaker or mechanic or a retail clerk, and you look up and say, oh, I'd like to do something about my member of Congress or what's going on in DC, you feel like there's nothing you can do because there's an instinct that unless you're a billionaire who can lob hundreds of thousands of dollars into the system, no one's going to listen to you or care about you. And unfortunately, there's a significant amount of truth to that feeling that that person has. The average successful congressional candidate raised $1.6 million the last cycle. It's $10.4 million for Senate candidates. And it's going to be a lot higher after this cycle because the Senate candidates, I don't know if you've noticed, are raising a lot of money. And so we're at a point now where money speaks much more loudly than people. And that's one reason why people are so fed up. We're fed up because the economy has become so inhuman and punitive, and it's just marginalized more and more people. The winner-take-all dynamics have funneled all of the gains and the wealth into the hands of the top handful of both citizens and corporations. And the rest of us are looking up saying, wow, what the heck happened? Why are all the businesses closing? This is all pre-pandemic too. And then once again, you feel like government, which is supposed to theoretically be a counterweight to the exploitation of millions of workers or the diminution of our standard of living or our way of life, is not really paying attention, that we're down to 31st in clean water and 28th overall in various social progress indicators, but it's okay as long as the stock market's doing well and the political parties seem to be thriving no matter how citizens are doing. So that's like my shorthand explanation for why people are so fed up. But a lot of it is because they don't feel like their voice makes a difference in this context.
So why ranked choice voting? How does it fix the problems you've just diagnosed? How does it re-incentivize our politicians and help create solutions to the gridlock, to the polarization, to all of the problems that plague us that you've described so well?
Right now, Congress has an approval rating of 21% or so, but the reelection rate is 94% for individual members. And so there are a number of reasons for that. One is that seats have been gerrymandered and written so that over 80% are what's called safe seats. So you have a lot of confidence that they're going to go either blue or red. And so if you're in one of those seats, you're more interested in staving off a primary challenge than you are in arriving at solutions that will benefit the broad majority of your constituents, because you're actually not really going to be accountable to the broad majority of your constituents, because by the time it gets to a general election, it's a foregone conclusion. So the incentives are not there for members of Congress to try and solve the problems writ large. They're more to cater to folks who are going to show up in their primary, which is typically less than 20% of the electorate, and generally the most ideologically extreme on one side or the other. So if you have ranked choice voting, all of a sudden your incentives change, where you think, okay, it's not enough just, and this assumes you have some kind of open primaries as well at a congressional level. So it's not just that you have to get your party's nomination, then you're done, but that you have some open primary in concert with ranked choice voting, where voters actually have a range of choices when it comes to the ballot box. And then it's not going to be enough for you just to cater to like the most extreme 20%. You're going to have to make a case to a broader number of your constituents. And you have to do so in a positive way, because if you just trash the other side, that actually makes you both look bad. And maybe there are 4 or 5 candidates. And so, if you trash person who's number 1 and you're number 2, then maybe you both look terrible and the number 3 or 4 wins. So ranked choice voting goes a very long way in adjusting the incentives of legislators so that they're lined up more with delivering value for the broader population. And it also reduces the ability just to demonize and villainize the other side and say it's all their fault, which also improves legislative incentives, because then you can't just be like, hey, it's their fault. It's like, well, actually, maybe I have to be responsible for something, because, because it's not just about me versus them. Maybe you have 4 or 5 choices and you don't have any pressure to feel like you can't, quote unquote, waste your vote. So there are a number of enormous improvements that are brought about through ranked choice voting. It's one reason why I'm so excited about it.
You must have noticed the primary in Massachusetts in the 4th congressional district. You had a large field of candidates and you had a winner. That's actually the second year in a row in which Massachusetts has had an election like this, a Democratic primary election that is won by a candidate in the low 20s. And so voters have 6, 7, 8, really interesting choices. But when you are only allowed to make one, you're always sort of looking around, thinking about spoiler candidates. And you end up with a winner that, in this case, more than 70% of people preferred somebody else. Now, on the positive side, all of those candidates pretty much endorsed ranked choice voting. They recognized it, but it's a real situation. Problem meets solution.
Well, this is one reason why I love ranked choice voting so much, and everyone who's here, thank you, because one of the myths about American voters and citizens is that they don't care about mechanics. They're not smart enough to care about process. But Americans sense that there's something broken about the way we actually elect our leaders and legislators, and that ranked choice voting will be a fix. We just need to get the word out to more people. But you can use that congressional or that race in Massachusetts. You can also use Trump's victory in the Republican nomination, where it's hard to remember, but Trump was not getting 60, 70% of Republican primary voters back then. It's a very crowded field. There were 7 or 8 folks. And if you'd had ranked choice voting, there's a real possibility that a majority of folks would have never congealed around Trump throughout the Republican nomination process, and he might not be our president today. Obviously, I think him being president is a very bad thing. So that would be one reason I'd make a case for ranked choice voting, is that it, like you said, Dave, it prevents someone with a very passionate minority from winning over someone who might appeal to a larger number of voters.
I think we could also, in many ways, use the 2020 Democratic primary campaign as a case study here. You've got 24 candidates. The pundits often talked about lanes, right? And I think most observers had a few candidates they liked, a few maybe they didn't, a handful they could be fine with. How do you think our presidential politics would be different with RCV? You had a terrific piece in USA Today last week in which you wrote that many voters are disenfranchised by the hurdles of in-person caucuses. Millions are admonished against wasting their votes, and delegates are awarded to candidates in a way that does not accurately reflect voter preferences. And of course, many voters, almost 3 million of them, who voted for a candidate who withdrew before Election Day, including about 160,000 of your supporters, ended up losing their votes in many ways. It's hard to imagine today, but the 2024 race is going to be here before we know it. How should we change the presidential primary process as we move forward?
I would love to see ranked choice voting in every nominating contest, because one of the major arguments you have to overcome in a lot of situations is the entire don't waste your vote. Like, you have to vote for someone who's going to win. And so then if Americans just said, look, just vote for whoever you like the best, and then you don't need to worry about it, which is what ranked choice voting enables. I will say selfishly too, I was apparently a very high number of people second choice. So I think I might have benefited from ranked choice voting too on a selfish level. Like, I was the compromise candidate for a lot of folks. But all selfishness aside, having lived through the process, it's clear to me that there's a lot of voter consideration around quote unquote electability. And the electability is shaped by media narratives around people and like different signals, shall we say. And those calculations are probably not great for policy or politics, in my opinion, because I think they would serve as essentially like a constant brake, like that they would just slow everything down. And we're at a point now where our government has been years behind the curve for a while, and we kind of need to speed up. Like, I think we might need to actually get ahead of some of these devastating challenges. So I'd be a huge fan of having ranked choice voting in the presidential nominating contests.
You suggested to the Washington Post in an interview earlier this year that it might also broaden our policy conversation if we can find ways to expand our democracy, allow for greater dynamism. You said that it should not take someone like me running for president to get universal basic income on the table. How do you think we can open up this process to include more points of view and to get more important and visionary proposals a greater, wider audience?
I'm glad you referenced that quote, Dave, because if you think about my candidacy and the rest of it, it was not like a common occurrence. And I think we're at a point where we need new ideas and new voices and new approaches and policies and solutions. And our political machinery is not very well designed to provide them. If you had ranked choice voting in more contests, then you'd simply have a more dynamic system, and there'd be more people proposing ideas and solutions that if enough people decided to get behind them, then you'd see real momentum and traction. One thing that I'm going to throw out as an example that I happen to be for is term limits. And one of the things that I found when I was traveling around the country is that it turns out the vast majority of Americans are for term limits for members of Congress, like something like 76%. And then you look up and say, okay, like, how can so many Americans be for something and like it never really seems to hit the agenda in a genuine way? And you can think about different reasons why, but ranked choice voting, I believe, would make different ideas surface much more often.
Are there other electoral reforms that are on your mind in addition to ranked choice voting, or that ranked choice voting might be a part of?
I think we need to attack it system-wide. Like, ranked choice voting is tremendous, but ranked choice voting would be most effective if you had open primaries, the party primary system. There's a quote from Boss Tweed that Lawrence Lessig used. You probably know it. It's like you can do the electing as long as I get to do the nominating. That's something that Americans, feel in their bones, like experience-wise. So open primaries, ranked choice voting, campaign finance reform in a very, very big way. I think HR 1 is a tremendous step in the right direction. I had a plan around 100 democracy dollars per voter, which I think would be better. So I would love to see that as the version of campaign finance reform that ends up getting the most energy. But I'm for the other things too. Like I love matching. I love some of the other measures that are out there. Anti-gerrymandering. You want to try and have fair districts. I think that Citizens United was wrong and that we should be curbing the level of dark money and corporate money. So I would want to do all of these things. But ranked choice voting is possibly like either one of or the most important among these. It's up there. It's up there. Uh, but we would do them all. There are some people, I think, in the text who have different impressions of term limits. I am 100% for term limits. Like you could argue for the duration. I would not be for term limits that are super short because that's probably not conducive to effective legislating. But I think it's not productive to have a seniority-based system and members of Congress who've been there for 25 to 30 years. And then if you show up, you're essentially waiting for a couple of decades in order to assume like a senior leadership post. That again is essentially a break on government evolution and advancement, where if DC seems like it's behind the curve, it's behind the curve in part because we have no term limits at all. And our legislature reflects that. So that would be on my list of reforms as well.
We've been talking a lot about Washington, a lot about Congress, but ranked choice voting's march extended into New York City last year as well, when the Charter Commission embraced it for most municipal primaries, many other elections there. It feels like RCV could answer a whole other set of issues in city politics. I wonder how you imagine what its impact might be like in New York City.
One thing I love about New York City is the entire donation matching program, where I believe it's 6-1. That's a lot. I mean, if you're a donor and you think, wait a minute, if I give you $20, like you get another 120, like that's actually a pretty powerful inducement for you to donate if you like the person. So if you have that kind of campaign financing system and then ranked choice voting, then you end up with like a very, very truly dynamic system where if you were an enterprising person and you decided to run for office, you can imagine a path to like 1,000 donors giving you $10 each. And then if you get a 6-1 match, then all of a sudden you're in the six figures, and all of a sudden you're like, you know what? At that point, I might actually be able to get my message out. And then you have a system where you don't necessarily need um, to be one of like the only one or two people standing. Like, you can say, look, I'll make my case. And if there are a bunch of us that you have a legitimate chance in a ranked choice voting system, it'd be very, very powerful for a true democracy. And I'd love to see more cities adopt it. I think that the local races in some ways are the most powerful laboratories for it.
We've got so many great questions from viewers that I want to start working a couple of those in. And I want to start with this one from Andrew, who writes, how do you think the technology should or shouldn't be involved with our elections? Can it be a useful tool in forms like voting apps, or is it potentially too risky to be manipulated by outside forces? And here we are in a year in which we're talking a lot about vote by mail, and we're using, and the Postal Service is wobbly and not properly funded. And there have been all kinds of political controversies there, and we're relying on a form of voting that I think a lot of young people probably who are used to paying bills online and not writing checks and dropping them in the post box. Are we ready for more vote by mail, or I'm sorry, voting online, or what do we have to do to get ready for it?
I believe we need to be trying to modernize our voting infrastructure in every way we can. And I'd even suggest it's one reason why people have low confidence in government is that it seems like government's doing things in a way that that's stuck in the past. And you look up and you say, wait a minute, why can I handle so much of my life online, except that this thing ends up becoming like an interaction with the 1990s.
The 1890s,
yeah. So that's not great. Now, I'm realistic about the fact that right now, could you run into massive problems if you just said, hey, guys, we're all voting digitally? Like, yeah, you could. But I do also think that right now there are political advantages that do not accrue to the population around the fact that fewer of us vote than should be the case. So we should be trying to increase the vote in many, many ways, and making it easier to do so technologically should be part of that. Uh, there'd be a period when, in my view, you might have to have very, very significant um, safeguards or fallbacks or even some kind of redundancy, like some of like the initial rollouts. But to me, that's still the direction you have to go. It's like you have to get to a point where people do feel like they can vote securely on their phone or online. This is an interesting convo because Lawrence Lessig has said something that I find persuasive, is that you want to speed things up and make it easier to vote, but you also want to slow things down. And his argument, which I agree with, is that if I just spring a question on an average voter and say, "Hey, what do you think about foreign policy?" or "What do you think about this?" then it's like, "Oh, I think this," and sometimes you're just expressing an opinion because it's asked of you, and the rest of it. And so he suggests that we slow things down by having a representative group of Americans actually deliberate on something and then get asked their point of view. He calls it deliberative polling. I think we should have that too. So I'm for advancing our voting technology so that it's more user-friendly and seamless, but I'm also for trying to slow things down and have like genuine deliberations and informed policy conversations, and not expect citizens to become expert in everything under the sun.
Here's a great question from Joseph. Lives in Massachusetts. He says Republicans have been vocal against ranked choice voting, despite the fact that many younger conservatives and most libertarians, including the party itself, are for ranked choice voting. And he'd like to ask how we can avoid RCV becoming a partisan issue.
I did not know. As far as I could tell, it was bipartisan. Like, who the heck's not for this? This is news to me. So I saw something online, and this is not representative of anything, but I'm going to use it anyway. I saw Ben Shapiro, who's a well-known conservative commentator, who said he's for ranked choice voting. So I certainly think that there's a diverse set of figures who are for ranked choice voting. I mean, I don't know how people consider William Weld, but clearly, he and I teamed up on that op-ed for USA Today. So I think that keeping it bipartisan is very important. I think there are going to be many, many conservatives and Republicans and libertarians who are for it. And we should do everything we can to keep it that way and amplify those voices.
I'm combining a couple of questions here, but there are questions about how we might get more candidates to advocate for RCV on the campaign trail, but also how we might effectively convince politicians who've been elected under the current system that we need to make change, and that change, when they have to vote to enact these changes, and it makes them anxious about losing their seat. How do we talk politicians into reforming a system that has benefited them?
This is a very important question. I think this is something that at least certain principled legislators will be for. I'm going to gently suggest that this might also be related to the term limits conversation. that if at some point you were like, you know what, I'm going to be gone like a little, well, I might as well set this thing up so that it starts working after I'm gone, as opposed to, having an infinite highway. We should, again, do everything we can to amplify the voices of the principled legislators who do come out for it. Certainly, one of the things that we're going to have to work very hard for is if we implement ranked choice voting in certain environments and then someone wins by that, then they'll naturally end up being like, "Hey, it was great.
Cool idea."
Yeah, so that's something that is going to be a lot of work, but that's where we should invest. Certainly, having people like me and Governor Weld, I think, is helpful. And I think there's a ton of appetite around this. And it's one reason why an event like today is so important, and the work that Fair Vote does and the work that you all are doing. It's that we have to make it clear to folks that this is the principled improvement that we've been waiting for to our democracy. and that standing against it is unprincipled. And unfortunately for current legislators, it may be just overtly self-serving.
We have a question from Greg about how many states do not have citizen-initiated ballot measures and have heavily gerrymandered voting districts that have led to disenfranchisement and preservation of the status quo. He's wondering about alternative avenues citizens might have for achieving fair elections in a state that's both been gerrymandered and also where citizen ballot initiatives are off the table.
No, I mean, this is a state by state issue. I think Fair Vote would probably have some great guidance for you on how to best tackle it. I love the fact that there have been these citizen-led ballot initiatives in some places where, I mean, that sounds very powerful, very effective. If your state doesn't allow for that, then we'd have to examine and see what the other routes are. But the folks at Fair Vote, I'm sure, are on top of the most efficient ways for citizens to activate energy in their state. It's tough. It's tough, though, if they've taken that off the table.
It is. Question from Jarrett about the terrific Our Common Purpose report that the American Academy of Arts and Sciences produced. And we had Daniel Allen on about a week ago to talk about. One of the recommendations is mandatory voting. And he wonders where you stand on that.
I don't hate it. I mean, I think the gap between here and mandatory voting is very, very wide, and that there are all of these things we could do that would help bridge that gap. But if you had mandatory voting, it would transform our politics very quickly. And I believe that many of those changes would be good because that there are a lot of folks that right now are disengaged from the political system, and we're getting increasingly unrepresentative outcomes as a result. So I'd be open to. I think there have been other countries that have done mandatory voting. For me, right now, I'm on the automatically register voters, make it easier, make election day a holiday, give everyone the day off and time off. Things that to me would make it easier for millions of Americans to participate. But I'd be open to it.
Question from a college student in a diehard Yang Gang in Cleveland, Ohio. How can Generation Z bridge the divide between the polarized right and left and focus on bipartisan solutions? And how can we best organize the youth vote?
Well, thank you for the support. I appreciate the heck out of you. The Yang Gang has been successful in drawing in people from different political alignments, in part because we're focused on solutions like this one. So I think that this event is in many ways the answer, where if you want to try and unify people, you can go to someone who's like on any side of the aisle and say, you know what, you might like ranked choice voting. And then people will be like, yeah, universal basic income was to some extent similar. That if we can focus people on productive solutions that they can agree on, then you can really attract people that might not have otherwise gotten together. And for Gen Z, this is so important because we have left you such a wreck. And it's in part because young people have not been as politically powerful as they should be, in my view. And our policy reflects that. And that's been happening progressively for generations. I just saw this stat about how millennials have a very small fraction of the nation's wealth relative to what the boomers had at the same age and stage. And that I suspect it's going to be even worse for Gen Z. So I'd love to help do something about that. It starts with young people like you being engaged, though. So thank you. And thank you for the support.
You have another supporter who wonders if you could have any cabinet seat, or let's expand that to any position, perhaps in government or public service, from which to make America more democratic and egalitarian. Is there something you would like to run? Where is change most possible and urgent on a bureaucratic level?
It's a great question. The mechanics of government are interesting in the executive branch. A lot of the action I was fighting for, and a lot of the stuff we're talking about, frankly, right now, it's going to happen legislatively in Congress. So let's say you're taking that off the table, which it sounds like this question is, and then you're looking at various executive branch opportunities. I think that I'm attracted to things where you have like a fairly broad footprint or mandate in terms of the amount of good you could do. So I would suggest that that commerce and treasury could be very, very impactful, highly, highly impactful. One thing I'm also interested in is helping to speed us up on technology related issues because just like ranked choice voting is to me like this umbrella mechanism where if you improve it, then it improves a lot of other things. One of the things that's going to keep us from addressing our problems is the fact that social media is turning us against each other and making us all kind of increasingly irritable, judgmental, and antagonistic. And so if you can help address what's going on in our brains via social media and broadcast media, because the broadcast networks are also rewarded for inflaming us. Like that's how their engagement and advertising revenues go up. Then that's going to keep us from being able to come together meaningfully. So I'd like to do what I can on the technology front, in part because I feel like there's a massive need there, and I haven't seen that many other figures who want to tackle it in the same way I would.
Do you think there could be room for a push to use RCV in companies and social organizations? Anne writes that her university marching band used it to elect their drum major back in the early 2000s, and that convinced hundreds of students every year it's a reasonable a method of voting. That's a pretty good way to kind of normalize RCV, which it feels like would go a long way towards speeding adoption and perhaps showing politicians that this is something people like, understand, and desire.
I love it. For everyone who's in position where you can make your club or organization or company use ranked choice voting, just start using it. Use it for what you're going to order for lunch. Be like, what kind of food are we getting? Like, have people rank it. Use it for your club leaders. Use it for everyone. And then that's going to normalize it. It looks like, according to Adam, the Oscars started using it. Look at that. The Oscars are ahead of the government, which is not that shocking, sort of. Yeah.
Robin writes from Switzerland, where they have multi-seat districts and proportional representation, that over 10 parties are represented in parliament. They all have to work together to develop policy that gets a majority of votes. Do you see such a system being possible in the United States? I know you've been a big backer of various proportional representation methods, especially in the Electoral College.
I think there's a lot of frustration with the Electoral College, and I think that like our Constitution is drawn up a certain way where we refer to it. I do it all the time. I refer to us as a democracy, which I think is very, very fair and correct. But then sometimes people are like, no, we're not a democracy. We're a representative democracy, or we're a democratic republic, or like the different technical terms. And those rules are fairly deep. like it's hard to get together a supermajority that can change some of the biggest rules. It is one reason why I love ranked choice voting. Again, to bring it back to it, is that like I think you'd see much more evolution in our thinking around some of the representativeness rules that we have if you had different legislators who've been elected in different ways. So that's my cop-out answer to that one.
Joshua writes that he's from a small rural county, and his mother, who often volunteers as a poll worker, has expressed doubt about RCV because of the long hours into the night that are already spent recording individual votes per race, that recording multiple preferences per race may increase the time required. We also see complaints that perhaps it might increase the number, the amount of time it takes voters and make long lines longer. Seems like more polling places would be, or expanding voting at home would take care of that. But I mean, I wonder, is that something you've thought about? And is that an objection to RCV you have heard? And if so, how you might answer it?
I think that's a kind of legitimate concern that if someone raises, you should take very, very seriously. It's like the mechanics of changing the process. To me, it's a great argument for modernizing our ability to vote in a particular way or investing in resources where, like what you said is like just get more polling places, which is obviously like easier said than done. There are many instances when ranked choice voting would actually save a ton of resources because it prevents a runoff from happening. So if you look at those situations, you're like, what would you rather do? Like 2 elections
Let's all come back to the polls for 4 weeks. Let's catch COVID a second time.
Yeah. Let's all come back and do it again. So there are clearly instances where ranked choice voting is going to save a ton of resources. Do I think that there are times when you might want to or make it more voter friendly if you're going to make this kind of change? Yeah, I think that's 100% legitimate. I also will say that we can improve the form of the form of our ballots. Where right now, even without ranked choice voting, how many of you have gone in there and been like, "What the heck do I do?" Like this is like this giant thing, and you're like, "What?" And then like you're just tempted just to like fill it all in down like a row because, I feel like, and there are all these positions that you meant to vote for that you had not really contemplated, but before so. I'm not 100% sure that it would slow you down that much, is what I'm going to suggest. Because if you knew how you had like your top line candidates ranked, then that might take you like an extra few seconds, I guess, like to rank them. But it's not like the ballots right now are like instantaneous anyway.
If a new administration comes into Washington in January, there's going to be a lot of challenges on the table. I wonder where you place democracy reform and these kinds of structural issues we're talking about among the massive challenges in the middle of a pandemic and economic turmoil and economic structural change, as far as where this fits as far as priorities in an administration over the first 100 days when they have momentum and a mandate?
Over the first 100 days, the job has to be to get relief into Americans' hands and try and dig us out of this hole. We're in a terrible, terrible, catastrophic situation for millions, tens of millions, and that takes precedence in my mind. Especially because, at the federal level, you're not going to have an election again for a little bit, like a couple of years until the next congressional race is at a minimum. So the focus has to just be on human well-being and welfare. And after that gets resolved, which it will not be resolved quickly or easily at all. I mean, we'll be struggling with this for years. But I do think democracy reform has to be very high up on the list. It's one reason why HR 1 is so important, and they talk about that as being like the first bill to pass, because our democracy has gotten very, very seriously out of whack, and we can all sense it. And we all have a dozen numbers at our fingertips that demonstrate how misaligned it is. So to me, democracy reform should be high on the list after we take care of people.
Can political parties, this is a question from Michael, having been a candidate in the national stage for one major party, can there still be support for electoral reforms if when that party is in the majority? How do we get a political party that's campaigned on these reforms to enact them if they have complete control of government?
Well, I was happy to see Elizabeth Warren came out for ranked choice voting in Massachusetts. That I think that there are many Democrats and Republicans who are for some of these reforms, and that their being in control of government does not necessarily make them less supportive. mean, certainly you can put me on this list, though maybe people don't really consider me like in the same light as some of the other figures. But that's one reason why we have to, again, maintain this as like a principled process improvement that's universal and bipartisan, so that if you're in power and someone comes to you and says, hey, you should have ranked choice voting, then if you're a Democrat or Republican, you're like, oh yeah, that would be an improvement. Uh, we can even appeal to people's better angels where we say, look, you must hate aspects of the current system. Like it's pretty terrible in some respects. Like, don't you want to have less negative campaigning? Doesn't your family hate seeing the ads trashing you? Like that would be the kind of appeal that could work on anyone.
There was a question asking you to clarify what you meant by ranked choice voting in open primaries, and how that's worked. And if a ranked choice voting open primary means all candidates across the parties compete, how would you suggest winners be determined? And how do they move on to the general election?
So the plan I saw that I quite liked was that you have open primaries and then you move the final 5 to the general. So you have an open primary and then everyone has at it. And then you don't need to win that thing. You don't need to win your party primary. So you could conceivably have, 4 Republicans and a Democrat in the final 5. You could have 4 Democrats and a Republican. You could have 2 Democrats, an independent, a libertarian, like whatever. Just whoever gets like the top 5 number of votes moves on to the ranked choice voting final, and then everyone just ranks the final 5, and then you don't have to worry about wasting your vote, and you know that whoever wins is going to end up getting more consensus support than the others. So you don't have that situation you talked about where the winner got 22%. Or I think one of the reasons why Maine loves ranked choice voting is that I think they had a governor win twice with less than 50%. So they were like, well, that's not great. So that would be the thought, is you have the final 5 vote getters move on to the ranked choice voting final.
Let me end with this because a lot of people want to know about your future plans. Have you given any thought to what any additional future runs, or I'm sure they'll be interested in having you perhaps serve in the administration. People have talked about the mayor of New York City. Where would you like to be? What are you imagining? What are you ruling out? And what can you declare for right here and make some news on the Fair Vote webinar series?
I'm focused on trying to help us turn the page in the country. So that's help Joe and Kamala win at a national level. People probably know I'm endorsing various down ballot candidates who are for universal basic income. Many of them are for ranked choice voting, I'm happy to say. Human-centered economy. I think that there's a massive opportunity there around helping local candidates win because, like you have an opportunity to try and do some very, very big things for the American people in 2021 if we do this right. And then if I'm in position to help us solve some of the problems I campaigned on, Dave, I would do it. And if that's at the federal level, then that's probably going to be the first place I look, because I just think we're in such a disastrous situation as a country on multiple levels. It's not just the pandemic or the economy or the racial injustice or technology. There are just so many big problems that are getting worse, not better. And so right now I'm focused on trying to help solve them. And it may or may not be ideal, but we only have one federal government. And I feel like it's irresponsible to run on things and then not take an opportunity to try and solve for those things if I get that opportunity.
Thank you again. This has been an amazing hour. We really appreciate your time and your leadership, your support of these issues. Massachusetts and Alaska, you have the chance to enact ranked choice voting. Get out there and vote yes. Early voting may well be getting underway very, very soon. Andrew, You're trying to get in. I'm sorry. I see you.
No, that's all. I'm just saying, like, go Massachusetts. Let's make this happen, minimum. And then just keep on rolling forward and appreciate the work that you do, that Rob does, Fair Vote. And I don't know if you all notice, but as an author, I notice Dave's books are behind his head. So you have Unrigged, which is about the work that that they're doing around the country. And I believe that's Rat Fucked over there, which is his other book. So really, to me, like we need to help the people wake up to the notion that we can do better for our democracy than our current voting system. And if people understood what ranked choice voting would mean, sweep the country. So that's why I'm happy to be here today to help energize folks to what is possible for our democracy.
Amen. Thank you so much for your leadership, for your time. Thank you to all of us for joining us. Come back, join us again October 27th at noon, the conservative argument for RCV. You can find out more about all of the things we're doing on our Fair Vote social media feeds, on Twitter, on Facebook. I want to thank Emily, the entire Facebook Fair Vote team for putting this together. We will see you in a couple of weeks. Thank you, Andrew. Yes, in Massachusetts. Yes, in Alaska. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.